Hi, everyone. It's actually super awesome to see you all here because with Corona and everything, I haven't had the chance to speak before a live audience in years. So applause back to you from my side. Great that you're here. And I assume you want to learn something, but I would rather start by telling you a little story. So it was once upon a time, actually last year, when there was still a lot of Corona restrictions, and there wasn't so many opportunities to travel, and the restrictions in Germany were quite strict at the time. It was spring, and hotels were closed. We couldn't really do a lot of stuff, and the regulations were changing from one week to the next, so it wasn't really fun to plan anything. But a friend asked me to spend a weekend with her because we had the opportunity to get a little camper from another friend. So we drove like 1 hour away from Berlin to a little lake where we found this cute little camper, and we were ready to spend the day at the lake, swimming and having fun. And we'd also planned a little romantic dinner under the stars for later. So we had brought a lot of fresh groceries to make a nice dinner. Well, we didn't really know anything about camping. I want to say that in advance. So I've never slept in a camper before, I think. So I had no idea what I was doing. And my friend also didn't have a lot of experience. We just got the key from our other friend and went for it. So, but how hard could it be, right? So we opened the door, found a very long extension cord, and thought, okay, maybe we can power the camper and the fridge inside with that to keep our food fresh and cold for the evening. We also found a power outlet on the side of the campsite, plugged everything in. It was a little harder to connect the camper because the outlet on the camper was on the back and a huge bead of stinging nettles, which wasn't so much fun. But then everything was connected, everything looked good. We went inside, but the fridge stayed dark. There was no power. Like, okay, this is bad because, well, it was very warm already. We didn't want our food to spoil, and most certainly wanted cold drinks. But even though we didn't know a lot about camping, I felt we were very well equipped to deal with the situation. And that's because, while I don't know anything about camping, I know a bit about debugging. Because I've been a software developer for 5 years now, and I've worked with a lot of different technologies. I've been 50% of the dev team at a very small startup. I've worked as a software development consultant, so I've seen quite a few things. I've seen different stacks, I've seen different technologies. I've worked with great colleagues, and I've also worked with very buggy code before. And I don't say that to talk bad about my colleagues, they're all great people. And I also say that knowing full well that often it was myself who had introduced those bugs. Because I think it's just the nature and reality of software development. Because very often you don't have time. So you have a deadline to meet, so then you cut corners and you make mistakes. Or another thing that happens frequently is that you don't have all the information you need. So you create bugs because you just don't know better. And with all these bugs that I've met in my life, I've also learned a few things about debugging. So I think it's a process, and sometimes you don't need that, right? Sometimes it's easy, but if you encounter something that's a really, really hard bug, it can help to just have some steps that you can follow to give some sort of guidance. And I think this is the steps that I usually go through. So the first thing is trying to reproduce the problem, right? Because if you can find a way to reliably cause the problematic behavior again, it's much easier to debug it. If you can't do that, then it's really no fun to do the rest of the steps. The second thing you would do is trying to understand what's actually wrong, what's causing the problem. And then after that, you can work on the final step, which is fixing it. But actually, that's usually not always the final step, because you also have to verify that it's really fixed, and not just for one case of many. And then the last step is something which I personally find very important, and that is trying to prevent the bug from coming back. Because that's something that happens easily when you, I don't know, you have a bad merge, or it was an edge case that you reintroduce again after some refactoring. So I would say always try to prevent it by writing a test that tests the exact behavior of this bug. And actually, it's much easier if you write the test first, because then you also have already a way to reliably reproduce the behavior. So you start by writing the test, you have a red test, and then for the rest of the process, you can always use the test to understand the bug, to fix it, to verify that it's fixed, and then you can skip step 5. I just put it here as an extra step because I'm sometimes also a bit lazy and do it at the end, but I think it's better to do it at the beginning. And also one thing I would like to notice is that while these were all nicely the same size, in reality it's usually more like this. You spend all the time banging your head around what the hell is going on and then fixing it, and the rest is quite easy. Okay, so this is more like the theory. Let's go back to our camper problem and see if we can use the bug process to debug the camper. Even though it's not software, I think the principles are always the same. So we have the camper. So it has no power. We don't know why. So what could be wrong, right? Maybe there's no power on the whole campground. We don't know. Maybe there's no power on our outlet. Maybe the camper is broken. Maybe the fridge is broken. So we can think of a few things that might be wrong. But, well, let's go by the process and start with step 1, which was actually be reproducing it. In this case, that's quite easy because the power is always off. So every time I open the fridge, it's still off. I can do that 100 times, no improvement. So, all right, step 2. We have some ideas, but how can we test them, right? Some of them are quite annoying to test. I mean, how would you find out if there's no power on the whole campground? We would run around and ask people, or maybe go to the manager's office. So what we need is something that gives us some insight and some visibility into the different parts of this whole camping system. So luckily, we brought some fairy lights or Christmas lights because we wanted to have some lights in the evening. And we could use those to see at which points of our power cycle we still had electric current and where we didn't have. So first thing we did is unplug the extension cord, plug in the lights to see if there's even power on our campsite. And there was power. That's great. So we have tested the first theory. We know there's power on the campsite, there's even power on our little plot, and so it has to be, something has to be wrong, starting from here to the fridge. Okay, well, testing the other theories are a bit harder, right? We cannot really figure out if the fridge is broken, only by excluding all other theories. So what we do next is we try to narrow down the scope of the problem that we're looking at. So because right now it's still everything on our campsite. So we have one state that we know is still working. That's a good state. That's the power outlet, because we tested there's power. And we know that the fridge doesn't have power. So we try to find something in between those two states that we can also test to reduce the scope of the problem that we're looking at. And in this case, we found an outlet on the camper that we could also test. We did that, and there was no light, so no power. So we now had a smaller problem, because we could think that the whole camper wasn't working. There was no power in all of it. But we know there was power coming out of the outlet. So it had to be somewhere in between those states. OK, so next thing is double check everything. So we did that. We unplugged and plugged both ends of the power cord. That looked fine. And then we realized that we'd kind of overlooked something else. Because the one big extension cord was actually 2 cords that were connected. And the connection was inside this red capsule, so it was waterproof. And we had kind of looked at it, but not really unpacked it. And when we did that now, it looked like this. So it was, we felt a bit stupid, I have to say, because, well, such a simple solution to a lot of running around and debugging. But I think this is very often the case with bugs. You look for the solution, and then in the end, it's something that makes you go, oh, well, that's underwhelming. The positive side of that is that it was super easy to fix, right? We plugged it in, we had power, we went inside, verified that the fridge was also now powered, it was. Everything was great. We skipped the prevention part here because it wasn't our camper. Otherwise, we might have looked for some ways to avoid this problem in the future. But the camping trip was saved. You see the lights, the camper, we have power, everything is working, the dinner was awesome, the lake was great. So, the camping trip was saved with the power of debugging. And what I think is kind of, I don't know, I think it's obvious to me is that in this case, again, step 2, understanding what's wrong, takes the most time and is the most complex. So I think it kind of deserves a bit more attention. I think there's a few more things that I'm doing here. So looking deeper into step 2, what I started with was like collecting everything that we know. So like a detective going around collecting all the clues that we have about the situation, and then like thinking about some theories about, okay, what's wrong here. Then trying to find a way to test all these theories. And then if we're out of theories to test, we just try to reduce the scope of the problem until we finally find a solution. And if we don't, we have to repeat the same steps again until we arrive at the solution. Okay, let's look at those a bit more in terms of software and not so much in terms of camping. First step, collecting the clues. So if you have a bug in software, what could that be? So the first thing you might get if you have a bug is a bug report. And if you're lucky, it has some useful information already. If you're unlucky, it's more like something, oh, feature X is broken, and that doesn't really help so much. But if you're lucky, it gives you some first ideas for which users might be affected, which systems might be affected, considering you might have multiple working together. So this is always a good start. And then the next thing I usually do is try to look for an error somewhere. So if you have an error, you have an error message. And I don't really want to tell you that because I know you're all very smart, but I have met people in my life who didn't read the error message, and I can only recommend to do that because usually it's very helpful and tells you a lot. And when you found the error, if you're lucky, and in most cases you are, you will also find a stack trace. And the stack trace is even more useful because it will tell you exactly the file, the function, and the line of code where you can start looking. Sometimes it's not at the end of the stack trace. So don't be intimidated by the whole thing because it's so long and red, but just scan it until you find something that looks familiar and might be your own code. Because in most cases, not always, most cases the bug is in your own code and not in some third-party dependency. So I would always start there, and then if you can exclude that your code has bugs, start looking for other people's mistakes. Well, okay, what I think we didn't talk about is where did you find these errors? So if you're lucky and you can reproduce the bug in your local environment, then it's usually quite easy because you can find it in your local shell output. You might find it in, if you're working on a web app, you might find it in the browser console, or you might find it in the network tab because it will show you some broken connections. If you're not so lucky and you cannot reproduce it locally, where would you look? Well, if you have logs, this is a great first place to look because usually errors are also logged, including the stack trace if you're very lucky. And if you're extremely lucky, you will have a good log processing and collecting tool like Kibana or Datadog or something else that lets you easily search your logs and you don't have to scroll through tens of thousands of them. Okay, so now we have some clues. Now we are going to formulate some theories. And I think this becomes easier if you have seen more bugs and worked with the software at hand a bit more, so you're more familiar. But even if not, I mean, the theories don't have to be super advanced. It can be maybe system X is broken and this is why our system isn't working. It's not super detailed necessarily, but it gives you some ideas for what you want to try. If you can come up with any theories, because it's totally puzzling and you have no idea what's going on, don't be afraid, you don't need a theory. We can also continue with some other steps. And one thing that's always a good suspect is unexpected dependency updates. Oh, sorry, you can't read it. Yeah, it just says, always keep your eyes open for unexpected dependency updates. Because if you do not lock all your minor dependencies to a certain version, it can happen that you didn't expect it, but some minor patch suddenly breaks something, and no one knows why. So always good to keep at the back of your head as a suspect. If you have some theories, it's time to test them. And as with the camper, it's best to start with the ones you can test very easily, because otherwise you can spend a lot of time to test something super complicated, but it will maybe not lead anywhere. And you don't always have to prove them. It also helps if you can disprove some, because it just reduces the scope of your problem. Okay, how do we test them? Well, for the camper, we had some lights, because we wanted visibility. And the same goes for bugs. What we need is some visibility into our systems, and also something that gives us fast feedback, so we can create these small experiments that help us test our theories. In the camper, we use lights. For software, we use other tools. For example, automated tests to create very fast feedback cycles, because you can run an automated test very fast. And if you have a complex set of conditions that cause the bug, this is often much faster than trying to recreate them manually through an UI. So always recommend it. And then you want to see what's going on. So again, logs are super useful here. But if you don't have them, you can always introduce temporary logs, temporary print statements somewhere in your code. Always a good tool for debugging. And then, of course, the debugger. I mean, the power of the debugger depends on your your language, framework, whatever you're using. But a good debugger is very useful because it helps you follow the execution, helps you look at values of variables. And just a little pro tip, what I like to use is also conditional breakpoints, because, as I said, we want to be fast. So if you have to step through 20 steps over the time to come to the interesting part, maybe it's easier if you can have a little condition and only see the debugger if you really need it. Yeah, so we have theories, we tested them, but maybe we're out of theories. We only have theories left that are super tricky to test, or we have no idea what's going on. So maybe at this point you're, I don't know, questioning your life choices to become a developer, because why do you have to fix this bug? Maybe you want to give it to some of your colleagues. But one thing you can almost always do is try to narrow the scope of the problem down. And I find this is especially useful if you're working with a microservice architecture, because you might get a bug report that just says something is wrong in this whole system. But if you can narrow it down to one specific small microservice, you're already at a much better state, because then you have more tools available. Debugging something in the network is much more annoying than debugging something inside one application where you can use all the tools like the debugger. So, as with the camper, what I try to do is find a state where I know everything is still good, working, and one state where everything is no longer working, and then try to find something in between that I can test to, like with the binary search, always, hopefully half the size of the problem space. And then, yeah, it's just basically keep going. Repeat all these steps, repeat everything you can do until you're feeling you're no longer making progress. What's progress? So sometimes progress can be a new error message or a new theory that you haven't tested yet. So progress doesn't always mean it's working now. Progress can mean, okay, I still have ideas what's going on. If you're really running out of ideas and you're feeling stuck, then I would recommend to stop, take a break. It always helps. I've solved so many bugs after I've come back from a break or even the next day. So if you can do that, take a little break. And then the other thing is ask for help. maybe the someone you ask is the internet. So Googling the error message is always a great first step. But other things you can also do is looking at documentation. If you think the problem might be the way you use a third-party dependency, so maybe you're using it wrong. So looking at documentation can help. And then open issues in your third-party dependencies, because while I said earlier you should probably not start looking there, sometimes it's really their problem. And then you at least know what's going on and can think about a way around it. If the internet cannot help you, the next best thing is to ask your colleagues. And one big tip I always want to give you is when you ask your colleagues is have some notes about what you've already tried. Because if you can already tell them what you've already tried and what you haven't tried, it's so much easier for them to help you, and they are much more willing to spend their time with you on this problem. So yeah, take notes. Also helps if you take a break and come back. All right, so. And then, when you've done this, and I think at some point you will be done with the big bubble of step 2 and understand what's going on. And then you're ready to fix it. At this point, I'm usually full of energy because I feel so good because I finally figured out what the problem is. And then I take this energy for the fix, but this is usually more like this. You spend countless hours trying to understand the problem, and then the fix is a one-line code change. So the PR is pretty small. Well, not quite, because you remember I recommended that we write a test as well. So the PR is the one-line fix plus some test case, hopefully. And if you wrote the test first, then we're almost done here. Yeah, and that's basically it. I hope I could show you a bit that debugging is annoying. But it can also be a bit like a fun puzzle, at least for me. Sometimes it's more like a challenge to figure out what's wrong. And the process that I've shown you, I want to be transparent here, is not what I do all the time. Sometimes I think I'm very smart and I just know exactly what's wrong and start with the fix. Sometimes that works. Most of the time it doesn't work and I have to go back and start from scratch. But it's more like a tool that helps me when I'm feeling really stuck on a bug, that I have something that I can go back to and go through. That gives me a bit of a framework. And the most important thing, I think, is trying to keep calm. And this is especially important if the bug is causing an incident and your users are now affected and cannot use part of the software. Because this is really a situation where I usually like to panic and freak out. So then I know it's hard, but it's really useful to try and separate your problem-solving mode from this panic mode and just try to focus on being the detective that's solving this case as long as you need to. Yeah. So I hope you had some fun. I hope you might also have some fun with the next bug you're tackling. And if you have some more questions, I'm around. I think we have time for questions. Or you can find me on LinkedIn. And I'm also usually at events of Women Who Code Berlin. So if you want to join those, they're online at the moment. So you just have to mind the time zones. Thank you very much for being my audience. It was really great to speak to you in person again. And I hope you also had some fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Does anyone have any questions? Okay.
I have a question, Sarah.
Yeah.
First, great talk. So I was wondering, I really like the comparison that you made with the camper problem, and it's actually quite fascinating as a developer myself how sometimes it seeps into your regular life and the problem solving. I wanted to know in your case, what came first, do you think? Like, do you think that you were pragmatic and a problem solver and that kind of helped you in software engineering, or if it was the other way around, if you found yourself a better problem solver because of your work?
I would say both a bit. So I think I was already a bit of a problem solver before, but it definitely helped. So the friend I was there with, she works in recruiting, and she was really like, "Oh, this is so like software. What you're doing?" She was very fascinated. So I think it was both. So I think I learned a lot from that, like this whole keeping calm and trying to see, okay, what do I know? What can I start with? What can I test? I think it got reinforced by doing that a lot with code. But maybe I also had a bit of that before.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Actually, I had another one. If
Sure.
you had a story or something like a special bug that you think really marked you, really stuck with you as a lesson.
Oh, I have one that was really horrible. And the worst part about that one was that was actually one that we couldn't reproduce. So it was super scary because it was very critical. We were trying to move our web application to a new infrastructure. And when we were testing that on the new setup, we figured out that there was a way that users could suddenly be logged in with some other user's account, which was really bad, which shouldn't happen in production. But we couldn't reproduce it. It was one user that reported it, and we couldn't figure out what was wrong. Because our tests were always like, oh, one person trying it, and it could only happen if there was multiple people doing it simultaneously. So this was a really tricky one, where this whole reproducing the bug was actually the biggest step, because we had to figure out a way where we are using then some AWS Lambda functions that were like always like trying to log in at the same time. And we didn't really know how many we needed, so we started with like just 10, 20, and luckily that was enough. But then having 20 users in parallel, then we were able to reproduce it and figure out that it was a bad caching setup, actually. But yeah, that was definitely one of the worst ones.
All right, thank you so much.
No problem.
Again, a round of applause for Sarah for just
No
being
problem.
great talk.